This is Duke University.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Serena Bazemore. I am the Executive Director of the Duke Center for Jewish Studies. It is my very great honor and privilege to welcome you to this evening's event, the Nuremberg Trials, its impact on international jurisprudence and contemporary human atrocities. I'd like to take just a moment to thank a few very special people who made this event possible. Dr. Dorita Berger for her tireless efforts in bringing Mr. Ferencz here to Duke, and Sharon Halperin for her efforts and help. Thank you. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors who have made this event possible: the Sanford School of Public Policy, the Center for Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Education of North Carolina, Duke Law, the Center for International and Comparative Law, and the Coalition for Preserving Memory. It is my pleasure to briefly introduce our moderator for the evening, one of our moderators for the evening, Jane Huckabee, Associate Clinical Professor of Law and the inaugural Director of the Duke International Human Rights Clinic. After serving as a human rights officer with the International Service for Human Rights in Geneva, Professor Huckabee joined the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at NYU Law, serving as its research director from 2006 to 2011, and also teaching in NYU's International Human Rights Clinic and Global Justice Clinic. She most recently served as a human rights advisor to UN Women, the United Nations entity for gender equality and the empowerment of women. She has written extensively on gender and human rights, and has most recently been the co-editor of Gender, National Security, and Counterterrorism, a Human Rights Perspective. I ask you to welcome Professor Huckabee.
Adjust the microphone upward often. My name is Jane Huckabee. I'm the Clinical Professor of Law and Director of the International Human Rights Clinic at the law school across the road. And it really is my great privilege and pleasure to moderate tonight's event entitled Nuremberg Trials, Its Impact on International Jurisprudence and Contemporary Human Atrocities. A topic that is always timely, but takes on particular resonance given that we are in the year of the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the Rome Statute, the groundbreaking treaty that established the International Criminal Court, the only permanent judicial mechanism mandated to investigate and prosecute genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. And with the ICC at 20, as we refer to it in shorthand, there have come a series of quite pressing questions about how we actually do ensure international accountability for heinous crimes. And tonight provides a really unique opportunity to reflect on what lessons can be learned from the Nuremberg trials and how international jurisprudence has evolved or has not evolved to adequately take into account the challenges in bringing individuals to justice under international law. It is very difficult to think of a more appropriate or perfect set of speakers to reflect on these issues. Benjamin Borel Ferencz is the last living prosecutor from Nuremberg, who was an investigator of Nazi war crimes after World War II, and the chief prosecutor for the United States Army at the Einsatz group and trials, one of the 12 military trials held in Nuremberg in Germany. I just want to make a remark that he was 27 at the time of that trial, and it was his first trial. So I think, and then he then went on to become an incredible and incredibly instrumental advocate for the evolution of international criminal law, including through the International Criminal Court. Now that was an objectively, totally inadequate introduction, and the reason I did it so quickly is that he will be more fully introduced by his son, Don Ferencz. Don Ferencz is the founder and convener of the Global Institute for the Prevention of Aggression and a co-organizer of the worldwide campaign to ratify the 2010 Kampala amendments to the ICC statute, the Rome Statute. Ferencz was a contributing author to the 2012 handbook on the ratification and implementation of the Kampala Amendments. Following that introduction, Mr. Benjamin Ferencz will then be in dialogue with Dean Michael Scharf, an alum of Duke Law, and Dean of the Law School at Case Western University. He holds many other positions, but I'll just mention two in particular, which is Director of the Frederick K. Cox International Law Center and co-founder of the Public International Law and Policy Group, a Nobel Prize nominated NGO. Following that dialogue, we will then open up the floor to Q&A that I will moderate. I encourage you, if you do have a burning question, to take note of where the microphone is on your floor, and we will have that discussion following the dialogue. Don, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Wonderful to see you all here tonight. This is quite a venue. A number of years ago, I was on a panel with the American Bar Association in New York with a partner from a New York law firm, and we had arranged that we were going to interview Ben Ferencz. And a few moments before we were to take the floor, I turned to the partner and I simply said, just follow my lead. And I looked at the audience and I said, interviewing Ben Ferencz is a little bit like trying to interview a freight train. The best thing to do is to get off the tracks and come back later and see what's left. So I'm not going to say an awful lot tonight, but I would actually, because this is my only chance to share any thoughts with you before we get started and the freight train leaves. Michael will tame the train, I know that. Dean Scharf, rather, who is a dear, dear friend of mine, so I call him by his first name. But I'd like to just share two thoughts with you, since the program tonight is about the Nuremberg trials, the legacy, the impact for today. I'd like to share two quotations from Nuremberg. The first of which was from the lips of the American chief prosecutor, Robert Jackson, who in his opening statement explained to the judges why they were going to try for the first time illegal war making itself. They called it crimes against peace at Nuremberg, waging wars of aggression. Here's what he said. He said simply, the common sense of mankind demands that law shall not stop with the punishment of petty crimes by little people. It must also reach men who possess themselves of great power and make deliberate and concerted use of it to set in motion evils which leave no home in the world untouched. He was going after the people with the fountain pens, not the pistols. Of course, today nobody knows what a fountain pen looks like. But I'd like to share one last quote before I say a few words, and I mean only a few words, about my dad. I want to share another quote from the jail cell of former Reich Marshal Hermann Goering, who was sentenced to hang by the neck until dead at Nuremberg, which he didn't do. He cheated the hangman by biting down on a cyanide capsule on the eve of his intended execution. But he was interviewed by an American Army psychologist, Gustav Gilbert, in his jail cell. And he was very candid, very frank, and very chilling in his remarks about how easy it is to take any nation into war, which is part of the motivation for my interest in criminalizing illegal use of force. He said, naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in England, nor in France, nor in America, nor, in that matter, for Germany. He said, that is understood. But he said, after all, it's the leaders who make policy, and it is a simple matter to drag the people along. He said, whether it is a parliamentary democracy or a fascist state or a communist dictatorship, he said, voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy, he said. All you have to do is tell them they're being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. And then he added, for good measure, it works the same way in any country. Now, with that, I will, instead of introducing my father, I will let my dad tell you what he wants to tell you, because let's get on with the show.
I thought that you were going to have some questions that might
We
be
were going to
bothering
do
you.
that. So
But
Did you want to say anything by way of self-introduction? Because I don't want to waste the audience's time.
I'll weave that in.
Michael's going to weave.
Why don't, yeah,
he's going to
we're going
introduce
to,
me, okay?
And I'll let you introduce yourself by answering these questions.
Okay.
Whatever you
I
like.
should say that, as Don said, I've been close friends with the Ferencz family for many, many years. I actually met Ben when I left here, Duke. I went to work at the State Department in the Office of the Legal Advisor, and it just happened to be the moment when the Yugoslavia crisis was occurring, and the Soviet Union had collapsed, and it was a moment when the international community finally got together and were able, through the UN, to get some stuff done. And what they did is they created the Yugoslavia Tribunal. But if we were going to create a modern-day Nuremberg, we thought we better consult the experts. And so we talked to Ben Ferencz and some of his colleagues who were still living at the time, and they helped us create a modern-day statute, which led to the Rwanda Tribunal and the International Criminal Court and the other ad hoc tribunals. After that, when I became an academic, Ben was nice enough to write the foreword and help me get my first publisher. That was 19 books ago. So this man has been a mentor and a friend. But let me help you understand where he's come from. Ben, you were an immigrant from East Europe. You grew up in Hell's Kitchen, New York, back when it was not gentrified. How did you get from that place as a poor immigrant to the halls of Nuremberg?
All right, following my son's mandate, I'll take over. Now, in order that you know that I'm standing, I'm telling you I'm standing. I hope you can hear me up there in the balcony. Is everything okay? Okay, you're out of luck, you'll hear me. Let me answer your question, as well as other things. It's true. I was a poor immigrant, refugee, fleeing persecution and poverty in a country which no longer exists, Transylvania. My sister was born in the same bed as I was. She was a Hungarian. When I was born in the same bed a year and a half later, I was a Romanian. What did I learn from that? Doesn't matter what they call the country. It matters how you treat the people. And we have to bear that in mind, because one of the main causes of war, there are three principal causes. One is religion, the second one is nationalism, and the third one is economic circumstances. So I hope in the course of how many minutes have you given me?
We have an hour.
Oh, an hour, you'll fall asleep. There are two chairs over here. Price, I put my bag down on a chair, have somebody sit, not on my hat, but put my hat up here, and then it's free for somebody. Come, just give it away. And some nice old lady, by old I mean something less than my age, which I will start my 99th year in a few weeks. So, so if there's any nice lady here who's only 98, you can take that seat. But don't get your hopes up. I've been happily married to the same woman for 72 years now, and we never had a quarrel. She's not with me now because she requires constant care, but that's the fate of the world. So what can I tell you? You want me to talk about Nuremberg, what our hopes were?
First, let's just see how you got there.
I got there very
how did that
simply.
happen?
I
Yeah.
got very simply. I was born in a country where they persecuted the Jews, persecution and poverty. To get out, we had to flee the country. We traveled third class on an open ship. The reason we went third class was because there was no fourth class. And we arrived in the cold winter with no job, two little kids, my young parents, no money, no language. We were very lucky to have some noble soul offered my father a job to be a janitor and take care of the house, and we would be allowed to sleep in the basement. And that's where my memory began.
And at some point, you got a scholarship to go to Harvard Law School.
Yes, of course. So we'll jump over all the rest of it. I did get another education too, but at a certain point, I lived in a high-density crime area. I decided that I'd rather be on the other side of the law. And I had made up my mind that I would like to be a lawyer. I didn't know any lawyers. I didn't know exactly what that meant, but I knew that because I was a little short, you might have noticed that, I had better be better than the rest. So I asked, which is the best law school in the world? Duke had not yet come on the question. And they said Harvard, and I applied to Harvard, and what do you know? They let me in. And what do you know? When they gave me the exam on criminal law, I was at the top of the class. So they gave me the scholarship, and I was off.
And one
Now-
of your professors there had was doing research on war crimes and you became his assistant.
Yes, I had no money at all. Partly I went to work for food in the divinity school, but also had a job to work as a researcher for one of the professors, Sheldon Gluck, who was a professor of criminology, and he was going to do a book on war crimes. So I read everything in the Harvard Law Library on that subject, gave him all the materials, and I became quite knowledgeable on the history and the background involving war crimes. What's your next question?
And then you enlisted in the military and
Oh,
you
let's
saw
not
some
get
war
so
crimes up
enlisted.
close
Not
and
enlisted me,
personal.
don't push me. I was in the law school, and what do you know? The Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor. Everybody I knew went down to enlist. I wanted to be a pilot. I applied to the Air Corps. Well, let me say first, I wrote to the FBI, and I said, look, I think you can use me best. I spoke French fluently at that time because I was in love with a French girl. Don't get your hopes up. It was Danielle Derrieux. I saw her on the movies, and they had the English titles underneath. And that's the best way to learn a language. And so I said, well, drop me down in French-occupied territory, teach me how to use dynamite, and the Germans will wish they were back in Berlin. But they said no. They came back. No, you're a security risk. Why? My father had acquired his citizenship as soon as he could read anything, and it was only 14 years ago. And you had to be a citizen for 15 years in order to be eligible for that kind of a Secret Service job. And so they said no. Another example of the brilliance of bureaucracies. Okay? However, I managed finally to get in, and the Air Corps told me I couldn't be a pilot because my feet couldn't reach the pedals. They tested me to become a navigator, and they informed me that if I were told to bomb Berlin, I'd probably end up in Tokyo. So I finally became a private in the 115th AAA Gun Battalion. Basic training in Camp Davis in Carolina. Now, what do you want me to drop
All
off
right,
from there?
now to be more serious, there are people in the audience that are children of and, in fact, Holocaust survivors. And you were among the people who liberated the concentration camps.
As we
What
got
was that
into
like?
Germany and began encountering, well, I would say this, they took me out of the artillery finally, good luck for the artillery, and they asked me to transfer me to General Patton's headquarters because the high mighty powers had decided they were going to set up war crimes trials to hold accountable and put the Germans on notice that they would be held accountable. And so I was told to go to the General Patton's headquarters. I reported there, and they sent me to the judge advocate section, and they said, well, we've been ordered to set up a war crimes program. What's a war crime? They had no idea whatsoever of what a war crime was like. They knew about absence without leave, they knew about desertion, but war crimes, they didn't know anything about that. So I think I was the first man in the United States Army to deal with war crimes in World War II. We had two early type of cases. First were Allied flyer cases. That meant an Allied flyer had been flying over German-occupied territory, and he was shot down very often by our own aircraft. 115th Airborne AAA Gun Battalion shot down our own planes as well. I am not sure which one they shot more down, but I have to go out and pick up the pieces of flyers and see if I could find a finger to identify the body. Anyway, one group of cases were these Allied flyer cases, American or British American. We dealt only with American soldiers. Shot down. He was almost invariably beaten to death by the mob. Lesson number one, vengeance and how it works. And to make it a little more alive for you, I'll give you one case in Groß-Gerau near Frankfurt where one Allied flyer came down and he was beaten to death by the mob. I arrived on the scene a couple days later, grabbed whatever official I could get, tell him, bring everybody into a room half this size, have them sit down. I'd say I didn't speak German at that time. I'd say, who speaks English and German? Okay, you, pretty girl, you're the interpreter. Tell them. They're going to write down exactly everything that happened. Who did what to whom, when, and why. Anybody who lies will be shot. Oh, I get to the human rights groups and I tell them, I did that. They say, you didn't say that. I said, yes, I did say that. What did you want me to tell them? Then if you lie to me, I'll take away your ice cream? What do you want me to tell them? There's a war on. How are you going to convince them? So I did my best to convince them that I'd blow their head off if they tried to lie to me. Okay? Was that a war crime? I knew about war crimes. I thought there was no war crimes. It's a principle of reciprocity. At every station, there was a big sign, Bekannt Machung, notice. If the Jews don't arrive at the right time for being transported to the gas chambers, there'll be a death penalty. Todesstrafe was the word that they used. There's a principle of reciprocity. If they're planning to kill me for not taking the train to their death chambers, I can have the same threat to them. I mention this only in passing. It's a small point of vengeance and law. Then the reports came of, we didn't know the word concentration camp, that there were stragglers seen coming out of, looked like some kind of a work camp. They looked like they were starving. They were wearing rags of all kinds. I rush off. The first one was Buchenwald. It was a 4 camp before Buchenwald. Went into the camp. Conditions, I don't have to describe it, I suppose, but maybe for the young people here, incredible, unbelievable, unimaginable were the conditions. People dead and dying all over the ground, every disease, dysentery, lice, rats running, human beings, starving men groveling in the piles of garbage for some morsel which could find some food, etc. Crematoria going, chaos. One incident when the inmates, some of them who were able still, we had the Russian prisoners there too, grabbed one of the guards and they cooked him. First they beat him with sticks, then they tied him to the gurney, and then they put him into the crematorium, into the flame, and they warmed him up, and they brought him out and beat him again and put him in again, and until he finally was roasted to death, okay? Excuse me, but I can still see it. Now I'm watching this. What did I do? I did nothing. Why not? Well, first of all, I think they would have turned on me if I tried to stop them. Secondly, I didn't want to stop them. It was very inhumane. Of course it was. I had interfered in France as we occupied there, and they were shaving the heads of the girls who had cohabited with the German soldiers. And that was routine. They took the girls out into the middle of the town square, they shaved their head off, hair off, and they spit on her. And I did counter that, and I'd fire a few shots into the air and say, she's under arrest. Get her into my Jeep and drive her away. Where do you live? Get out, So I mention this because you don't know what war is like. And the main point of my coming here is to protect you from having to go through that type of experience. Now, where do we go from here?
Well, before we start talking about the big picture and peace,
Right.
Let's continue to talk a little bit more about Nuremberg, and let's talk about the role you played in having the Einsatzgruppen case be tried.
Okay. The Allies had promised, warned the Germans there would be trials. There was the International Military Tribunal trial, which took place in Nuremberg. The United States was represented by Justice Robert Jackson on leave from the Supreme Court, one of our most respected jurists. The French and the sent equal powerful men. The British did the same. And we had these international trials. They were charged with various crimes. Aggression was one of them, crimes against humanity, war crimes. And Justice Jackson wrote the decision The most important things, in my judgment of the decision, was one, crimes are committed by individuals. They're not committed by nations. They're not committed by groups. They're committed by people. And you should hold only those responsible who are responsible for the crimes, not as we usually do. We declare the whole country or the whole ISIS or the Schmises. This are all terrible, kill them all. That was not the holding of Nuremberg. Nuremberg said you prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt for a violation of existing law, and then you give him the appropriate penalty. It was the first lesson, which we have forgotten. I'll try to give you only things which are overlooked. So, another most important conclusion. War had always been glorified. It was a national right, a right of sovereignty, to go to war and decide for themselves when they go to war. So what had always been hailed as the road to power and prestige as being important and lawful was condemned at Nuremberg as an international crime. What had been an international right was condemned as an international crime because there had been many declarations, Hague agreements and treaties which had condemned it. And people should have known that this is not lawful behavior. And what the Germans did, they should have known and must have known that it was criminal. And therefore, it's just to hold them accountable. And that was a very important principle too, that warmaking is a horrible crime. They said it's a supreme international crime because all the other crimes are committed in connection with the war, and I can attest to that from my own experience. I've never heard of a war without rape of women. There never has been such a war. There never will be such a war. If the women want to do something, you're never going to have a perfect situation where all crimes are stopped. But if you want to deter at least some of them, you must condemn them. And if you condemn warmaking and recognize that it's not a glorious thing, it's hell, and that it will include certainly rape of all the women, wake up, and see that's not something that you favor or will even tolerate. You must act against it.
You know, what's fascinating about what you were saying about individual criminal responsibility is after Nuremberg, Telford Taylor decided to have 11 additional trials of the judges, of the generals, of the industrialists, but probably the worst of the worst would have escaped justice if not for you. How did that come about?
Well, when the war was over, I went home. The Army had their procedures, would have taken me maybe another half year or a year, but Bing Crosby said, you'll be home by Christmas. And I had written to my girlfriend, the same one I've been married to for 72 years, and I said, I'll be home by Christmas. And when they told me what their procedures were, first you wait 6 months in this camp, then you get transferred to that camp, I said, look, I joined the Army to help win the war. We won the war. Goodbye, I'm going home. And so I did. And they usually took a dim view of what I was doing, but and I was honorably discharged the day after Christmas in 1945. My discharge papers say that I'm awarded battle stars. And I said, what is that for? I said, I was no hero. I said, well, you landed on the beaches of Normandy, didn't you? Yes, I did. Then you crossed the Rhine at Remarque, and yes, on a pontoon bridge, riding a jeep, which could fall into the water at any time. And you went through the Maginot Line and the Siegfried Line and the battle of this one and the final battle and all the 5 major battles, and you didn't even get killed. So I said, well, that's a good idea. Give it to the guys who didn't get killed. So I was awarded 5 battle stars, and I came home. Now, I was with 10 million other people unemployed. What do? I'd gotten out of law school, I had passed the bar, and no job. Well, somehow the papers I applied or whatnot, I got a letter from the Pentagon at one point. They said, sir, they'd never called me sir in 3 years. We'd like to talk to you. So I went to Washington, and there I was met by Colonel Mickey Marcus, whose name some of you will recognize. He was a Jewish West Pointer who was assigned to recruit men for the subsequent proceedings, as they were called, to go into the other facets of German life. And Telford Taylor, General Telford Taylor, he was a colonel at that time, promoted soon to general, whom we were later law partners in New York and were friends until he died. He was supposed to set up these trials. And so he managed to interview me, send me over to see Colonel Taylor, and I saw Taylor, and he said, well, the Army was trying to get me to go back for the military trials they were putting on. I was not eager to do that. I said, I will not go back into the military unless you go back to war again and are losing. The military and I didn't get along very well. I'm talking about the American military, let alone the Germans. So anyway, Taylor said, look, I've been assigned by the president to do this job, and I'd like you to consider joining me. But he said, I've been checking up on your record, and I find that you're occasionally insubordinate. I said, that's not correct, sir. I'm not occasionally insubordinate. I'm usually insubordinate. I don't obey any law order that I know is stupid or illegal. But he was a Harvard Law graduate, too. I said, I don't think you'll give me that kind of order. He said, you go with me. So we had these 12 trials, but if you have the prisoner and you don't have evidence against him, as law students, you know you've got nothing. And if you have the evidence and you don't have the prisoner, you've got nothing. So I had to find the evidence for those suspects that we already caught in the net. And so I set up a staff of about 50 people in Berlin, which was the center, which had all the archives of the military and the banks and the foreign office and so on. And we go through them. These were all refugees, mostly who fled to the United States, who knew the language better than I did, and combed through the files for incriminating evidence. One day, one of my researchers, a nice boy from Switzerland, came and he said, look what I got. And he hands me a folder, something like this. Ereignismeldungen aus der UdSSR. That's my German. I speak German now. Reports from the Eastern Front. And these were daily reports by groups which were given a name which nobody could identify what they did. They were called Einsatzgruppen. Einsatz means action, groups are groups. And their assignment was to follow behind the German lines as they penetrated Poland and went into Russia and so on, and kill without pity or remorse every single Jewish man, woman, and child they could lay their hands on. That was their assignment, and that's what they did. And then they so stupidly reported all of that to higher headquarters. Higher headquarters consolidated it, and I got the report. So I hopped on the next plane down to Nuremberg, and I said to General Taylor, I said, sir, we've got to put on a new trial. He said, we can't. The lawyers are already assigned. The trials are in progress. Some of you saw the film Judgment at Nuremberg. That was a sample of the type of trial which was already in progress. And the IMT trial was already over. He said, we can't put on a new trial now. And I said, you can't let these guys go free. I have in my hands mass murder on an unparalleled scale. He said, can you do it in addition to your other responsibility? And I said, sure. So he said, you got it. And so it came to pass that I became the chief prosecutor for the United States in what was certainly the biggest murder trial in human history.
1 million victims, right?
Over 1 million victims, women and children shot one shot at a time. Quite horrible story.
Do you remember still the very first line of your opening statement?
Yes.
Could you recite that?
Yes, I do remember, because I took great pains in asking myself, what do you ask for? I selected the defendants from a list of about 3,000. We had the roster for the Einsatzgruppen. And I picked out, first of all, you have to know that it was a ridiculous limitation. We could only try 22 people. Why 22? Because that was the International Military Tribunal trial, and they only had 22 seats. So if you didn't get a seat, too bad. So for the ridiculous reason, I had to pick 22. They have to be in captivity, high ranking, and I picked the highest, best educated. So I picked generals and people with PhDs, and I made them the defendants, because I, as an enlisted man, knew that enlisted men don't count, hold accountable those who are responsible for the deeds. And in the opening, I said, what do I ask for? Now here I know they killed over 1 million people. They killed the gypsies the same as the Jews. They killed homosexuals. They killed anybody they thought might be a strain on the German economy. What do I ask for? What would you ask for? You say chop them up into 1 million pieces and feed them to the dogs? It's a possibility. But I thought, no, this is only a brief sampling of criminals. And you can't think in terms of justice for all those who are victimized. If we could come up with a rule of law which would save everybody, that would be something of permanent value. Because I recognized immediately that the victims were slaughtered, murdered, simply because they didn't share the race, the religion, or the ideology of their executioners. And I thought that was a terrible thing. And I still think that's a terrible thing. And I have never stopped thinking that it's a terrible thing. And so I selected the men who met those characteristics. And I rested my case in 2 days by simply introducing the documents. First, I had the man who assembled them in Berlin testify that he was in Berlin and he collected the reports and so on. You have to have a basis for the documentation you're submitting. And then, having verified that, I introduced that and I rested my case.
How did you start? What was your opening sentence?
The opening statements were, and it did not appear on some of the thing was filmed at the time and we've recorded and saved it. But the opening sentence, we have when the judge says, we'll now hear from the prosecution. The cameras didn't start rolling till after I said the first sentence, which was very important to me, because the first sentence was, it is with sorrow and with hope that we here disclose the murder of over 1 million innocent and defenseless men, women, and children. The theme of sorrow and hope is what I wanted to be the theme for what I was doing. And my goal was, and I said that as well, made the first use of the term genocide. That I knew Raphael Lemkin, who had coined the term, but my goal was a plea of humanity to law, and it's the right of all human beings to live in peace and dignity regardless of their race or creed. And it applied to all people. I didn't care what their sex was or their religion or their gender or anything else. They were entitled to live as decent human beings. And I thought if I can get that in the judgment, that will be a step forward in the law. And of course, that was in the judgment.
And Raphael Lemkin, who you knew, was at the time sort of a not well-respected professor who was running around trying to convince people to use this term genocide. Arguably, if it wasn't for you using it in the very first ever time in a court of law, there wouldn't be a genocide convention, there wouldn't be the concept we now know. How did you decide to use that?
Well, I think it would have existed even without me, because he was very persistent, and I know the people who worked on it. They were friends of mine, Hemi Robinson, and
But you gave it a nudge at the right time.
I was the first one put it in a case, because if it's not listed in statute, you can't charge it. And I knew that, but I put it in anyway. Just referred to it as a crime. It was not listed as the charges in the indictment itself, where we accused them of crimes against humanity and war crimes, which it was. So I was trying to give it a leg up, and that has caught on. People like slogans, they like new names, and the word genocide, you may know or may not know, I was raised in poverty most of my life, but I went from rags to riches, and I give all my residual funds. I didn't give any to this fellow, not much anyway. I gave some to the Holocaust Memorial Museum because they had a genocide section, and it's a permanent organization, and I couldn't take it with me, so I thought I'll go out the way I came in with nothing, and it would make me happy that way. So I gave them all my residual funds, or promised all of it to them, because I expect to live another 25 or 30 or 40 years. So the reason I expect that is because I'm so busy working, I have no time to get old. I have no time to die or to get sick. Okay, so
So most people, if they only knew about you that you had prosecuted the biggest murder trial in history, that you were the first to use the word genocide in a criminal court, they'd still be packing this crowd. But after the war, you then played a huge role in the reparations from the German government to the victims.
I'm
Tell
glad
us a
that
little
you
bit about
mentioned that, because it's usually overlooked.
Yes, it is.
There are various facets of my life. First was to stop the war. I don't know what General Patton would have done without me. The second thing, of course, was to catch the criminals. He described to catch it and stick it to them. To only a few select cases. This is not justice. This is a sampling of what happened. That was the second step. The next thing, you have to take care of the victims. Now, that is, if you were to ask me what do I think is the most important achievement of my life, it related to getting compensation for the victims. And I tell you how that was, if I may, because I usually don't talk about it, and no people are interested. I was approached first, the Einsatz group and trial was over, and I was ready to go home. I wanted to get out of Germany, never go back. I was approached by a representative of the American Joint Distribution Committee, which had a headquarters then in Paris. They were taking care of the refugees who were not going to Israel, who were remaining anyplace else in the world. And they said, look, we have a provision in the law which says that the property which has been stolen from the Jews, taken under duress, has to be returned to the rightful owner. Ordinary principle of equity. All of you who have been students first year, if you steal somebody's property, you coerce them into selling it. When the coercion is over, you can reverse the transaction. But they had so many heirless and unclaimed properties because the Jews were killed. Or there was a currency conversion. It's another problem. It was a big headache. Well, I don't want to go into it. I'll be here all night. But the restitution program, they asked me if I would take on the responsibility of carrying out that military government law number 59 and claim the property which had been stolen from the Jews, and the unclaimed or the heirless portion would then be used for the benefit of the survivors. Well, it sounded like a very noble goal, and I said, I've talked to my wife. She was also a refugee like me from Romania, Hungary, and she said, how long did they say you should take the job? I said, well, they thought it would take 2 years. She said, well, I know you, it'll take 1 year, so how can you say no? 10 years later, when we came back with our 4 children born in Nuremberg, what took it so long? Well, the first thing I did there, to show you chutzpah, I designated myself the Director General of the Jewish Restitution Successor Organization. Now, being the Director General, where I was the only employee, was designed to impress the Germans. Okay, and then, I don't know how much time we got for these stories. Anyway, we had no money. They said, we have no money. We can pay you a military salary for 6 months, but we don't think much is going to come of it anyway, but we feel we have an obligation to try. Okay, we tried. Well, the first thing I need money to get staff. I have to locate the property. I had a 3-month filing deadline. I said, I got to get an extension. So I went to see the commander, was General Lucius Clay, for all the occupied American zone, which is what we were dealing with. And I said, General, I need an extension of the law. I can't locate all the Jewish property within 3 months. He said, I can't give you an extension. I said, well, I need an extension. He said, look, we want them out of here. We don't know when the Russians are coming in. They might come in tomorrow, they may start. We're poised, to deal with the Russians. And I don't need a bunch of DPs and DP displaced persons camps. We have to worry about them. I said, look, I need money for it. Can I get the money from the United States occupation funds? He said, no way, because you require quadripartite approval. The Russians will certainly not agree. I doubt if the English will agree either. And I can't do that. I said, can I borrow the money from you, from the American segment, and when I get restitution and can make enough money, I'll pay it back. He said, can I do that legally? And I said, well, I have a memo in my pocket which says you can. He said, okay, then go down and talk to the finance guy, tell him it's okay, but move. Oh, I went down to see the finance guy, and I said, I'm just coming from the general's office. We're putting on a rush program here, and I need to grant a loan out of occupation funds. He said, how much you need? I said, well, let's begin with $1 million marks. That's like saying, come and give me $10 million. He didn't care, it wasn't his money, so bing. I got funded, and off we went.
And let me speed this along because I want to make sure there's time for the Q&A. At the end, how much money did the German government pay because of your program?
By the time I got through with that, it was just the restitution of property was only one segment of it. Then what happened was something which never happened before in human history. The German government was persuaded, the initiative came from Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, who was a devout Catholic, who said publicly that terrible crimes have been committed in the name of the German people, which impose a legal and a moral obligation to try to make amends. And that began the whole movement of negotiation. What do you mean by amends? Who, when? And at that point, something interesting happened, which is worth repeating, I think. There was a terrorist gang set up in Israel saying, what? You're going to sit down with those Nazi bastards who killed my parents, and you're going to talk to me about money? You're going to talk about compensation? Have you no shame? You all should be killed. And they set up an organization of terrorists designed to kill all of us who were engaged in that. And they had some measure of success, which I don't want to talk about. But what was interesting is one of the main leaders of the terrorist gang was a gentleman by the name of Menachem Begin, who became the Prime Minister of Israel and won the Nobel Peace Prize. So be careful who you call a terrorist. It may be in the eyes of the beholder. Anyway.
And it goes the other way, too. I remember when the Taliban were freedom fighters called Mujahideen.
They've got plenty of terrorists. When one you don't agree with, you call him a terrorist.
All right, let me ask you another question. When you were in your 90s, you were asked to give the closing argument of the very first case before the International Criminal Court, which Jane reminds us just turned 20.
Yes.
What was that like?
Well, I got a call from Marino Campo, and we had known him for several years. I campaigned for the creation of the court in every way I possibly could. And everybody knew me, and so he figured he'll invite me as a matter of honor to make the closing remarks for the prosecution. It was also very wise because although his English is excellent, it's much better if you speak Spanish. So with his accent, he was well advised to call me to do the closing statement. That was my second case. The first was 27 years old. The second, I was 92. Of course, the man was convicted for using child soldiers. Moral of that story is it takes a while. It takes a while to do.
Yeah, that was your second case as a prosecutor, but you were telling me earlier today about a case that you defended during the Vietnam War during the secret bombings of Cambodia, right? So you had, and that was part of your theme also. You felt that you wanted to stop war.
I came to realize, and very early on, that Justice Jackson was right, the International Military Tribunal was right. Aggression is the supreme international crime because all the other crimes are committed when the social fabric is torn down and there are no controls. We still have not done anything about enforcing the rules. I found in my experience there was 3 things we are concerned with. First, to define what it is that we're trying to prohibit. Then, such as seizing of territories, killing of civilians, rape of the women, and so on. Secondly, set up a court to determine who is guilty of those crimes. And third, prevent it from happening again. And that, of course, means you have to enforce the law. If you don't enforce the law, you got nothing. You got paper. And we are still in the first and second stage. We have defined through the statute of the International Criminal Court, constantly being amended. I could tell you a little more about that, being blocked by the United States on the phony argument that they haven't, it's not clear enough. Hundreds of lawyers, and I have sat through hundreds of days, maybe thousands of hours, in the special meetings of the United Nations. The committees are debating, accepting the definition of aggression. And they only recently came up with a definition of aggression, which also has so many loopholes in it that there's a big dispute as to whether the court can really act on it. Because the big powers, led by the United States, are not prepared to allow any foreign court to determine whether they should go to war or whether they should use armed force or not. They're just not prepared to do that. Now, reasonable men may differ. Our Supreme Court, a great Supreme Court compared to others, is often have a split opinion. And the question arises then whether it's permissible to do all these things, and where is your enforcement arm? We haven't begun at all. Nothing has been done. To follow the UN Charter, they were called for disarmament. What disarmament? They have arms races today as we sit here, but now they're in cyberspace and spending billions of dollars every day, which could be used to pay for your tuition, kids, and for the old people for their medical care, and for all the other things that they could be using to preserve and save and make life more tolerable, instead of building more weapons to kill more people. And the current system, whereby they take young people like those in the balcony, here they're not so very young ones, but take young people like you, and they send them out to kill other young people they don't even know, in countries they may never have heard of, and people who never did them any harm. And they kill each other until they get tired of killing. Then they stop, and each side declares victory, and then they rest for a while, then they start again. That is the current system.
And Ben, let me just set you up for the crescendo that you're reaching at this point. You've written several books where the theme is law, not war.
Yes.
You've dedicated your life to it. You've created a foundation. You've given $10 million to the Holocaust Museum, all to this vision. In the last couple of years, you've become the equivalent of a rock star among lawyers.
Oh, why?
You were on 60 Minutes. How many of you saw him on 60 Minutes in April? Yeah? All right. You've been feted on Hollywood. You're going around the country at your age, and I know sometimes having the energy to fly to North Carolina from Florida is not the easiest thing, but you do it because of this vision, because of your drive. And you said today in the airplane to me that you said, should I do the rallying cry? Should I start the revolution? And your son and I said, do it, Ben.
Okay.
Do it.
Okay.
So let's hear it, Ben.
Okay, I'm going to give it to you straight. I'm talking to the young people. The old people in the front row here, you've done your share. You can support what I'm doing. But the young people, they're on the firing line. And they can, I'm telling you now, we had the capacity disclosed to me when it was still secret at least 10 years ago. The United States now has the capacity from cyberspace of cutting off the electrical grid on planet Earth. In other words, somebody's going to push a button and the whole planet has no light, no water, no nothing. How long would it take? I asked the general who told me, how long would it take for everybody to die? He said, well, we haven't yet done any studies on that, but I would guess that it would depend upon the amount of water they had. If they had water, they might live for a week. If they didn't, they'd probably die sooner than that. You're the target for the next one. The nuclear arsenal, that's obsolete already. They talk about, got to get rid of nuclear, give you a Nobel Prize. Sure, you should get rid of nuclear. You can't possibly use it because it'll poison everybody who's in the area. But they're not going to use it. They just don't know what to do with the nuclear waste. They got the devil by the tail. So I'm not worried about that. I am worried about cyberspace and who's going to use it and who's going to be the first to use it. And when the president threatens, if he feels threatened by another government, or a threat to our allies, we will destroy him and destroy the country. What are you talking about, Mr. President? What are you talking about? You kill all the people? What are you going to do? Take them out and shoot them all? as they did with the Einsatz group. So we are in a stage where you are poised to face annihilation. They can't annihilate me. I'm immortal. You can see that. Well, almost. I'm immoral, so let it go at that. So what can you do about it? He says, wrap it up now. The guys have to go home. I'm speaking now to the young people, to the students. Form student bodies to protect yourselves. I know people are guided by slogans, so I invented a slogan, law, not war. I know that even a bad legal decision is better than any war, because war is indescribably horrible and will continue to be increasingly horrible for the remainder of your days, if there are a remainder of your days. So it's a critical point in history where the politicians have not yet recognized that the world has changed. Your lawyers have to reflect the needs of the society in which they operate. And the first requirement of law is to let everybody live in peace and harmony. That's what law is all about. And it is being ignored. Not only ignored, but I'm just thinking of the actions which are being taken in defiance of that common sense. My son referred to the common sense of mankind. Is it not common sense, instead of sending young people out to kill other young people they don't even know, for reasons that are not clear, which they were lied to about that? The Vietnam War, they said we had to do that because they have nuclear weapons. They never found the nuclear weapons because they were never there, and we knew it. And we knew it. And so they're lying to the public. And they include the United States, and I consider myself a very patriotic American. I appreciate everything, the opportunity it gave me as a poor immigrant boy, and for that reason it's leaked out here that I give them everything before I go. How are you going to respond to that? You're going to accept it lying down? You're going to wait and go to the politicians, and you're going to go to the diplomats? They don't hear what you're saying. They're more interested in preserving their personal power than your lives. I don't like that idea. I think it's contemptible, and I don't think we should accept it. I don't think you should accept it. I'm not accepting it either. When the United States says we cannot define a crime of aggression, for 70 years, they bring in hundreds of diplomats to take and argue and debate it, and I'm sitting there and listening to all that crap. Excuse me, language, it's permissible. So they're sitting there and arguing and quibbling about the definition of the term of aggression. I say, forget about the term, call it a crime against humanity, call it genocide, that's what it is. Every war is genocide. Nobody declares war anymore. That whole concept is obsolete. I talk about the illegal use of armed force. And what do I mean by illegal? It's not in self-defense. Self-defense is permissible and has always been permissible. So we have to change our whole concept. Get with it, kids, get with it. The world has changed. And the politicians and the diplomats have not yet wanted to recognize that. And as a result, your lives are in danger. And if I were in your shoes and were about 80 years younger, I wouldn't take it, and I don't tell you to take it. The things you can do. I know that we can do the impossible. I know you'll tell me it never happened before. Nothing that's new ever happened before. And of course, it's impossible to end all wars, but we can certainly make a big dent into it if we bring the enforcement arm out, clarify what is tolerable and what is not. Criminal punishment is a deterrent to crime, not only punishment for the individual, but find his bank account and seize his bank account as well. And those who cause a harm to innocent people should be responsible to pay for the harm or to try to heal the harm. That's what I tried with the restitution program, for which $50 billion had been spent by the time I left Germany. But it's a drop in the bucket. They continue to pay some more. The West German government. Let me tell you one story.
And then we should open it up for the questions.
Okay. Some time ago, a few years ago, got a call from the German Foreign Office. They'd like to give me their highest civilian award, Verdienstkreuz Erste Klasse. And looked like something that Rommel used to wear around his neck. And I said, I'll let you know. And I met with some of the survivor groups I've been in touch with over the years. And I said, look, the Germans want to give me this medal. What do you think? And I got from some the same thing we had from the Israelis at the beginning. What, are you crazy? You're going to let the Germans use you as a pawn to try to whitewash themselves? And they felt I should not accept it. And I understood their concern, and that's why I went to talk to them, because I expected that. But I explained to them my feeling. My feeling was one of my greatest regrets during the time I lived in Germany, 10 years about. I never met a German who said, I'm sorry, because they were ashamed or they weren't sorry. And I said, this is the attempt of the new German generation to say, I'm sorry. And it would be unfair and unjust for me to say, no, we're going to hold you accountable also for the crimes of your father or your grandfather. And I took the medal. And I've still got it. It's in a drawer somewhere. But that's the issue. The world is changing. Pick up those who believe in human approach. Hatred gets you nowhere. Vengeance gets you nowhere. That's what I saw and described the killing of an SS man who certainly deserved it, but it was the vengeance crying out for, in an irrational way. And the impossible can be done. We've seen it a million times. Our great Constitution didn't give the ladies the right to vote or to own property. Try that on today. It's in the Constitution, but nobody would dare make such a suggestion. The Wright brothers said, you give me a wing, I'll put it on a bicycle, I'm going to fly. So they said if God wanted man to fly, he would have given them wings. It's impossible. There are so many things. A man can marry a man. A man can become a woman. All of these things which were considered impossible are realities today. What in the world is so difficult about taking law instead of war? It's the common sense of Jackson when he said that this is the common sense to do. Use your money to help the people, not to kill the people. And I can't persuade him. I do all I can. I write, I talk, I go on television, wherever. There are only so many hours in a day. I don't know what a day's vacation means. So I ask you, in your own behalf, think it over. Are you ready to take it lying down? Or you say it's too difficult? If this little guy from Transylvania could do as much as he did, why can't you?
You know, we live in scary times. And it's fine. So,
Where were you liberated? Where were you liberated?
we do live in scary times, and Ben Ferencz is a clarion call for a note of sanity. And as he says, especially to the students in the room, the next generation, Ben's not going to be around to carry the torch forever. It's your turn. We have time for question and answer. I'll turn it over to Jane.
Thank you very much. Don, you want to jump in?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to ask a question.
Okay.
Okay.
Am I live still?
Well, let me just say a few words, and then we'll
Sit down,
begin
sit
to go to the question component. So thank you, and particularly to thank you for that impassioned call to our extraordinary students who really are the agents of change in their communities, locally and nationally and globally. We are moving to the Q&A part of our evening. If you want to ask a question and answer, and I see some folks already lined up, we have microphones here, and I will also take a few from the floor if you're not able to get to a microphone. For folks at the very top, if you really want to ask a question, please gesture dramatically so I can see you, and also be prepared to shout. We don't have a microphone at the top levels. I'm going to take advantage of the moderator's prerogative and ask a question to begin, then also have Don ask a question as well. Ben, you mentioned the challenges around the United States government in many ways impeding the effort of accountability through the International Criminal Court. An important development in that regard is at the end of last year, in November of last year, the prosecutor of the ICC asked the court's judges for authorization to begin an investigation into crimes against humanity and war crimes in Afghanistan since 2003. It's currently her publicly stated intention to pursue an investigation into violations not only by Afghan government forces, but also non-governmental forces and also foreign forces, including the US military. It would be really helpful to hear your reflections on that development.
I think you've all heard the question. It's a fair question. A brief summation is, how come it's so difficult? What we're trying to do, what I'm trying to do, and I hope you will be trying to do too, is to stop war making and use the rule of law instead. You have to get into the country to see the evidence, be able to arrest the prisoners, be able to put them before a fair court. In the current world situation, that's often impossible or very difficult to do. Countries like Afghanistan, the government themselves are complicit in committing the crimes. They won't let anybody in. You have to know the language, you have to have staff. All of these difficulties are there, but they don't discourage me because it's a prototype, it's a beginning. The baby has just been born, and it's still, the enforcement arm is still missing. Until that comes on scene, the rest is a lot of talk. But when I see the progress that's been made, when I began, they said it's impossible. You'll never get a court. We have a court. And not only we have a court, they call me to go do the statement on that opening statement. That's a message. That's a message that the world is changing. The old timers say, no, we don't want to get involved in that. And I'm sorry to say the United States has taken a backward position on this, but it's a great country. People are entitled to their opinion. They believe power is the only thing that counts. If you've got the power, use it. Never mind anybody else. Well, that's your nose that's right in the way. So that's it.
The question behind you.
Sit down so she can see the next question.
Okay.
And I'm
You're
live
next.
here.
Yeah.
I wasn't really happy with his answer. So I'm going to tell you what I think is the answer to that question. Just to reiterate the question, the United States now is perhaps going to be investigated by the International Criminal Court only for potential criminal abuses. Now, we're in the United States. Some of you who are historians of ancient Greece, my dad likes to talk about Thucydides occasionally. He says he didn't know him personally. He was the he was a historian who chronicled the Peloponnesian Wars. And he said something very realpolitik sounding. He said then, in 350 BC, that the powerful, the strong, do what they can, and the weak endure what they must. If you fast forward several thousand years and you go to Washington, D.C., and you look over the United States Supreme Court, you'll see 4 words etched in stone with a different message: equal justice under law. If it isn't equally applied, it isn't real justice. Now, we as Americans say the Pledge of Allegiance, liberty, and justice for all. Outside the shores of the United States, a lot of people think we are misrepresenting what we really mean when we talk about liberty and justice for all. Some think that the American mentality now is liberty and just us for all. So when the international prosecutor takes an oath to independently prosecute without fear or favor the crimes which are the greatest crimes known to mankind, the most serious crimes, if he or she turns a blind eye, then we see that not only is justice blindfolded, but blind altogether and deaf altogether. And we as Americans, if we believe in the rule of law, if we believe what we say, we have to make good on the promise. If it isn't equally applied throughout the world, it's not real justice. So that would be my comment. And the question I wanted to ask is a much more, how can I say, lighthearted question. You know, I've heard my dad talk a lot. And I first heard him when he used to tuck us in at night and tell us stories. This is, by the way, how he honed his skills as an orator. And I would always ask him to tell me the same story over and over. And I mentioned at the very beginning that I was there interviewing him in front of several hundred lawyers, and I got out of the way. But at the end, we had some questions, and I put a question to him. I said, Dad, did you ever knowingly swear out an arrest warrant for someone you knew to be innocent? Now, I thought he would know what I was talking about, but in the heat of the moment, he looked in the audience and he said, I would never do such a thing. Would you care to elaborate on that story?
It's on your time, yes. He accused me of arresting somebody I knew was innocent and getting an arrest warrant, and it's true. I was indicated that the Army and I didn't get along very well. U.S. Army, German Army is another story. They didn't allow our wives to come with us when we went back to Germany. I think it was the Fräulein Union wanted to keep the American wives back home. In any case, on the first ship coming over, my wife was, of course, we had been wed, I don't know how many weeks before I took off, was on the first ship coming in. And I knew that everybody was warned that you cannot come up to the dock in Bremerhaven because it would have been too crowded. All the soldiers would be there and waiting for their wives. Well, I was not inclined to be kept away from my newlywed wife. So I went to the Adjutant General's department, and I was in charge of the whole Berlin operation. And I said, I want you to make out an arrest warrant for me. Okay. Who's the best? There's Gertrude Ferencz. Okay. So, armed with the arrest warrant that I had, I went to the dock, and there was another guard there, and there was a woman, and she was typing out passes to get on the ship, and she starts telling Benjamin Ferencz, war crimes prosecutor, arresting a witness to crimes, you know, so the name of the person, pretty much, Gertrude Ferencz. He said, just type it out. So I got the warrant, and as I approached the ship from the dock, the women are all lined up on the cup. They've all been without their husbands for I don't know how long. They began to scream, it's Benny, it's Benny, because she told them, I don't care what the Army says, he's going to be here. So I went on board, and I embraced her until the captain of the ship said, who let that man on? And they threw me off the ship. But I had by that time told her to come meet me in Berlin and so on. So that's it, at the museum.
Okay, I think given our time limitation and our very healthy queue, we'd like to have a chance for everyone to ask questions. We might take 3 at a time. So you had a question, and then we'll go to the back. And I'll find most of you as we can.
3
So,
questions at a time. And then
That's bad. Okay.
Ben, my name is Abe, and I'm a Holocaust survivor. I was liberated near Dachau, and I was in all camps in Auschwitz and Weihinger and Eschenwald. But after the war, when I came over here in 1947, when I was 18 years old, and so it was no work, and I joined the Army, the American Army. I went from the frying pan to the fire again. So, and I applied for restitution, and I never got it because they told me you were healthy because the Army took you in. So I still didn't get it, and it's 71 years, and I still didn't get it.
You didn't get any compensation for your imprisonment?
No.
Then you had bad representation. You should have gone to the United Restitution Organization, of which I was the director. You would have been compensated for the time in incarceration, certainly.
That's the reason what they said. I went to Boston to the German consulate. They said, well, the Army took it, so you must have been healthy. Otherwise,
Well, health, if you were claiming
sir.
injury to your health and the Army had taken you, your claim would be rejected. But for the incarceration in a concentration camp, you would certainly be paid at, unfortunately, small rate of 5 marks a day. And you should have gotten compensation there. So if you haven't received any compensation, you've been badly represented. I'm sorry.
well, I'm getting a little pension from them on the hardship.
Okay, you got you in on, it picked you up on the hardship fund.
Thank
Later,
you,
we
sir.
got a hardship fund to cover the case which had slipped through the net somehow. I'm very glad to hear that you're getting a compensation from the hardship fund, and I hope that all Nazi victims, regardless of their race or religion, are also beneficiaries of that law, which took us years to negotiate, many legal battles on the way, and it's only symbolic, but it never happened before in human history, that the victims of a war were individually compensated by the defeated nation. I'm sorry it wasn't more. I didn't control it. We did
Okay,
the
I think
best
we're going
we
to go
could.
to the
Okay.
microphone at the back. Can we take 2 questions in a row and then answer the 2 at the same time? Thank you.
What's he saying?
If Goring's observation is as true today as it was when he was alive,
Okay.
and I believe it is, then it might seem that nothing has been learned from Nuremberg.
What was the comment?
It wasn't a question, it was a comment.
What was
That if Goring's observations are as true today
Right.
as they were then, and
Right.
they are,
You can answer that.
then it would seem that nothing has been learned from Nuremberg.
Well, we've learned a lot from Nuremberg in principle. We have not yet lived up to the expectations and the hopes of Nuremberg, and that was to try to eliminate war making, illegal war making, the illegal use of armed force, which means it's not in self-defense. So we still have a long way to go, but we are making good progress. I say we spiral upward. We go up and then it comes down again, and then we spiral up again, it comes down again. We have international courts, thanks to this distinguished professor here, reporting from all around the world, international courts trying people for war crimes of various kinds. Never happened before in human history. We have dozens of countries and dozens of trials. They're not perfect. They all have problems. They're newborn babes. Give them a break. They will grow up and they'll improve.
Sir, at the microphone.
Good evening, and thank you for being here for the panel. Just a quick statement of terrible irony that the gypsies and Jews were being killed because it might be a strain on the German economy, yet the labor of the concentration camp also enriched the German economy. How do we prevent more war when we think they've got a nuclear weapon, or when we think they're going to do something that we don't like? Since we did that in the war of Iraq, how can we keep that from happening again?
He asked, how can you keep a war like we fought in Iraq from happening again based on this weapons of mass destruction?
The only way you can prevent in the future what's happened in the past is to unite in your clear perception that such methods are intolerable. They are criminal, they are crimes against humanity, they are genocidal, and they are suicidal. And if you can spread that word among the young students first, who will come back and say, hell no, we won't go. Mr. President, whoever it may be, you go. That's the only way you'll do it. Turn to the public. Don't rely upon the people in high office because they have not lived up to their trust.
I'm going to go to the next floor, but I also, to echo the theme of what we've been talking about, I'd really like to encourage any students to also make sure that you make your way to the microphone so you have a chance to also engage. So anyone at the top?
There is a mic up there.
There's a microphone up there. No one's
You'll
there?
have to transfer it. I can't
Someone's
hear
hiding
that.
from the microphone? Okay, there's a microphone up there if you'd like to make your way
I'll
up.
help you.
Student,
Yeah.
yes. I prefer you make your way to the microphone if you don't mind, and we'll take another question in the interim.
While we're waiting, may I just make a quick comment, public
Sure.
service announcement? My dad has a website, www.benferenz.org. And on that website are all of his writings, all of it's free for use in the public domain, as well as something which is quite interesting. I mentioned he used to tell me these stories. He has published these little vignettes called Benny Stories on the website, telling a lot of historical details, which are quite interesting. So I would just encourage anyone who's interested, because we're only going to scratch the surface tonight, that if they're interested, they should go see his website. They'll learn a lot.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much for coming and speaking to all of us. My question would be very much similar from the gentleman who asked the question about Iraq. I'm a master's student in Sanford School. I'm originally from Afghanistan, and I can relate to so much to what you spoke this evening. I understand that war is never the answer. And I think as professional, most of us here understand that this is not the answer and should never be pursued. But how can you solve a conflict that's so rooted into the culture where war and sending armed forces can only be the solution? How can you solve a conflict where there is no way to negotiate with the radicals who just want to blow up people? I mean, I understand that here a lot of people obviously would be against sending more troops to Afghanistan, but given the current situation that we are facing, only in a month of January, we lost 200 civilians. How can you tackle this issue without sending armed groups? Thank you so much.
You heard the question?
I think so. I think the answer to your question requires an awareness of fundamental change which is necessary in our thinking. I call it the change of hearts and minds. We have to recognize that it's not cowardice to compromise. It may be a necessity. Also, if you show your adversary that you're not threatening him to eliminate him or to kill him as people, you're prepared to tolerate differences of opinion, providing it does no harm to others, no matter what the subject may be. If it does no harm, praying to a different God or a different school or a different synagogue or church or whatever, it should not be condemned as a punishable crime. We have not yet reached that. We react on our prejudices and our reactions. Our sympathies are always with our particular friends, even if they're not right. And so we have to be able to detach ourselves and think rationally and humanely about the best solution which is possible under the circumstances. It may be imperfect and probably will be imperfect. There'll be some people who won't agree, and there will certainly be such. But you cannot accept the use of armed force as a means of settling disputes, because the power to use it has grown so enormously over the last years that you're threatening life on Earth. And sometimes people have to sit down and think it's the lesser of evils to take a more humane position. And if you agree with my point of view, you'll do it. If not, you'll go out and try to kill somebody. Maybe you'll succeed, and maybe he'll succeed in killing you, or both.
Okay, I'll go back to the microphone.
Yes. I just finished reading the book of Senator Thomas, Christopher Dodd of Connecticut. His father, Thomas Dodd, was also a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trial. My question is, did you get involved with Senator Dodd in the interrogation of Goring, Hess, and Speer?
What did you say? What about Goring?
He was asking whether you were involved with Senator Dodd at Nuremberg with interrogating Speer and those guys.
I was not involved in the Nuremberg trial against Goering and Speer. I met Speer when he served 20 years in Spandau prison. And I wanted to see him. I wanted to see him because I had written a book called Less Than Slaves, in which I recounted my experience with the German companies. I was trying to get compensation for the slave laborers who had worked for those companies, like I.G. Farben, which built the Auschwitz camp. They provided the money for the camp, and others, Siemens, AEG, Telefunken, the big German names. And in every case, without exception, I got the same kind of response from the industry. We didn't do it, but I have evidence that you had. We have your request to Speer's office for, he had to allocate the labor. He was in charge of providing labor. They said conditions were fine. They were treated the same as German workers, which was not true at all. And every single point, they just denied everything. And I said to Speer, this was after he had served 20 years in Spandau prison. I've been in Spandau prison. It's a rough prison. And of course, the four powers divided, each one took 3 months. And when the Russians were there, they were getting even with what the Germans tried to do and did to them. But I asked him, I said, look, I have your correspondence with them, part of the evidence I'd collected, saying that they had to request inmates, that they had to show that they could secure their not running away, means putting them in a camp with barbed wire, etc., that they could only be fed the minimum for sustenance of life and not more. And I have all of these letters, and the German industrialists all say it's not so. How do you explain that? He said, simple, they're lying. I said, of course, I know they're lying, but can I quote you? Now, at that point, I thought to myself, even before the meeting, he's liable to say, hey, listen, Jew boy, I served 20 years, get off my back. I thought I might encounter that, but he had written some best-selling books while he was incarcerated in prison. And he said, they're lying, and I said, I would like to do then is I will revise it according to, I'll give you my manuscript, and if there's anything wrong, please let me know, and I will correct it. And I want it to be the absolute truth. Harvard Press will certainly not publish anything which is false. So would you agree to that? He said yes. So I went over the manuscript. I sent him the manuscript again. I didn't change anything that I'd written. And he wrote back on every page, einverstanden, einverstanden, agreed, agreed, agreed. He didn't change a thing. Now, what does it tell us? He was not sentenced to death, although his deputy was sentenced to death and hanged. I saw that, and I saw it in his books, which I read in English and in German, that there was a real element of remorse, in which he said, look, those were the times. Hitler was a big personality. He gave me a high position. I didn't challenge the things that I should have challenged. It was not a total confession of guilt, but it showed me that he had a humane feeling in retrospect. And so it's not the same category of person. These are human problems, and human beings are fallible. And some of our own soldiers go around committing crimes all the time. All soldiers in all wars commit all crimes. Wars make murderers out of otherwise decent people in all countries, on all sides. And it's not only murder, rapists, robbers, thieves, and so on. It's the nature of warfare. And so I say, let's move away from that. The illegal use of armed force, which is warfare, should be seen for what it is, an abominable, disgusting crime which will not be tolerated under the banner of patriotism or necessity or anything else. It's not a weapon that can be used in this century, because once you start going on that path, then the one with the biggest weapons is going to kill you all.
So we have time for only one more question, and I do encourage people who don't get a chance to ask a question to attend our reception afterward on the first floor, where you'll have an opportunity to interact. I want to go back up to the top. We have another student who'd like to ask a question.
Related to the last answer, my question is both to Professor Scharf and Mr. Ferencz. Can you talk about the distinction you make when you're prosecuting about whether you can prosecute everyone who's responsible or whether you have to make decisions that are in the best interest of society, especially given in Iraq that a lot of the people who form the base of ISIS now were Saddam's former power base? So how do you make that decision about whether you can prosecute everyone who is responsible, or do you have to draw a line between what's law and what's best for society?
You want to answer?
She asked, how do you draw the line?
I'll start it off.
Who you prosecute?
All right, so, many of you may be familiar with a book called Hitler's Willing Executioners by Daniel Goldhagen. Are we on? Okay. And the book basically had the thesis that so many people in Germany were willing executioners, were willingly involved in these crimes against humanity, and that the idea that they were all following orders and coerced was not true. But at Nuremberg, the Allies realized that they couldn't prosecute everybody, and they didn't want a repeat of World War I, where they had reparations against Germany, and that led to the rising of Hitler. So they decided that they would have accountability, but really only accountability for those who are most culpable. And when they created the Yugoslavia Tribunal and the Rwanda Tribunal, the Special Court for Sierra Leone, the Cambodia Tribunal, and now the International Criminal Court, they decided that they would focus on those who were responsible for the worst possible crimes, like the Einsatzgruppen people, and those who were the highest up. And that is based on several different theories, one being that they have limited resources, but another one being that you really can't successfully change a population if you're prosecuting everybody. And this happened actually in Argentina when they were prosecuting people for crimes against humanity. And they started at the colonel level, and when they went down lower, there were uprisings. And they decided that they had to have an amnesty in order to keep the country moving forward. So in fact, international justice has always been related to realpolitik. There is a notion of politics and justice. It's not just pure and fair, and it can't be. And the world, unfortunately, it's not a perfect world, and we haven't reached perfect justice, but even imperfect justice gets us a lot farther along than just a firing squad. And one last thing, if you remember when they were debating what they were going to do with the Nazis on the eve of the end of World War II, it was Churchill who said, let's just have a firing squad. And Stalin said, I've got a list of 50,000 people that will line up and kill. And it was the United States that said, no, let's have trials. And that was a bold experiment, but it is one that is caught on. And I think the world is better off for it, as evidenced by everything that Ben Ferencz has said. Do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you've answered to the voice from heaven, which came from up there.
Okay.
Please join me in thanking our